Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're really delighted to welcome you to this BRISMES Student Section event on thinking about publishing your first academic article or book. This is the third BRISMES graduate event that we have organised to take place on Zoom, and we are very excited to have a really brilliant panel with us today. I'm Marral, and I'm a PhD student and a co-president of the BRISMES Graduate Section. So I'll just start with a few words about the BRISMES Graduate Section. BRISMES is a forum for educators and researchers in Middle East studies. We aim to encourage and promote interest by sharing information and encouraging cooperation in the scholarly study of the region. The graduate section aims to create a network of support and advice for current and prospective graduate students. We host events and workshops that are of interest to the student and ECR community. We raise awareness of academic resources, funding opportunities, and career opportunities, both within and outside academia. We aim to make BRISMES more representative and better equipped to promote Middle Eastern studies. We help the BRISMES Council understand and meet the needs of its student population. So if you like today's event and to really get the most out of the BRISMES community, we really encourage you to join BRISMES as a graduate member through the website, and I'll share the link in the chat later on. We're open to collaborations and to support students in the wider BRISMES network, so please do get in touch if you have any ideas. And so I'm just going to introduce the chair now before handing over Dr. Lewis Turner, who is a BRISMES Council member and lecturer in international politics of gender at Newcastle University in the UK. He is a political ethnographer of humanitarianism in the Middle East, particularly Jordan, and his work investigates questions of gender, especially men and masculinities, refugee recognition, vulnerability, labour market integration, and race and racism in humanitarianism. His research on the Syria refugee response has appeared in journals including International Feminist Journal of Politics, Middle East Critique, and Review of International Studies. And he has received prizes from professional associations, including the British International Studies Association and the Political Studies Association. Currently, he is part of the ACEAL project, an EU Horizon 2020 funded project investigating the interactions between emerging international protection systems and the United Nations Global Compact for Refugees. So yeah, hope you enjoy the event. Thank you for joining us, and I'll hand over to Lewis now.
Thanks, Marral. Hi, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this event. Thank you very much for joining us. It's wonderful to see so many people here. And yeah, a really big thanks to Marral for organising this and for all of the work that you've been doing as co-president of the BRISMES Graduate Section, which is a really growing and exciting part of the organisation. So if you're not a member, please do think about joining. In terms of the format for today's event, so we, as Marral mentioned, we have 4 panelists, each of whom will speak for 7 to 10 minutes on their experiences and expertise. And the event will touch upon a range of themes related to publishing academic books and articles. The themes will include the academic journal publishing process, the book publication process, differences between preparation for a journal, an article and book publication, and finally also advice on what publishers are looking for. So that will allow then about 45 minutes in total for the contributions from the panelists, followed by approximately 45 minutes for discussion, question and answers. So we'll be finishing about 3:30 today, UK time. So in 90 minutes in total. And to ask questions, we'd ask you to ask questions in the chat, and then those questions will be read out. You can direct your question either to one or a certain number of the panelists or to the panel in general. And you can ask questions either as you go along or later when we get to the Q&A session, and we will be reading them out. And we are really grateful to the 4 fantastic panelists that we have today. So we're very giving up their time and joining us and sharing their expertise today. I'll introduce them all in more detail as in turn. But so you know, the four speakers will be speaking in the order of firstly, Sharri Plonski from Queen Mary University, London. Secondly, Nadje Al-Ali from Brown University. Thirdly, Maria Marsh from Cambridge University Press. And then Stephanie Cronin from the University of Oxford. So firstly then, Sharri's teaching and research are primarily anchored in the case of Palestine, Israel, and its regional and global relations. She has a book and several articles out in the world on these themes, but she is also avidly working with a collective of researchers, activists, and thinkers who are concerned with ongoing settler-colonial relations as both international and place-based, material and ideational, structural and agentive. From 2019 to 2022, she has been principal investigator on an ESRC new investigator grant entitled From Walls to Corridors, the Global Logistics of the Ha'amak Railway. Over to you, Sharri.
Hi, everyone. So I'll keep track of time. Hopefully I won't talk for too long. But so I tried to think a lot about how to talk through that initial steps on your publication journey. And I'm not great at talking about a general kind of everyone fits this particular textbook approach to their publications, to getting, you know, used to the idea that your work is going to be out there in the world. And so I thought I'd talk through, I guess, my own particular experiences, and hopefully from there we'll be able to extrapolate some lessons, both maybe good things that you could do, but also along the way a lot of like the wrong decisions probably. But it worked out. So just to give you a really quick kind of view of where I'm at, like Lewis already mentioned, I work at Queen Mary University. I got my permanent post there in 2019 and finished my PhD in 2015. So that's quite a journey. For some will feel long, for some will feel like, oh, that's not too bad, but definitely felt long and definitely felt like took a lot out of me to get to this point. And so I definitely want to emphasize the fact that I don't think that there is some kind of perfect CV or perfect cookie cutter approach to how academic publications can work for you, and also how you fit into that kind of academic arena. And that you need to, I think from the get-go, I think you need to respect who you are and how it's okay to define your own, kind of carve your own path within it. Whatever else is happening, because if you're not authentic to who that is, it's just going to add stress and not actually take you very far. It actually ends up being really debilitating. And the more you're authentic to yourself, I think the better chances you have of really being happy with your work and happy with the way that it appears in the world. So I think I'm going to divide this into, I guess, 3 publication experiences and kind of what I think I learned from them. And then you can ask me more about them later. So the first one is the book. I finished my PhD with someone who was starting a new publication series. He was a series editor for a New Palestine series. And so the first thing that happened to me is I didn't have a choice. I literally finished my Viva and was told, okay, you're publishing here. So the wonderful thing about that is I didn't go through any of the obstacles or hoops that people go through for that first publication. As some of my colleagues, I'm sure, will tell you later, there's a review process, there's, you know, getting rejection, I didn't go through that. I went straight into the process. So on one hand, I knew I was going to get published. So that's a great thing. The wrong thing, I think, from that is that it also meant that not a lot of people engaged with the full manuscript or was able to advise me on what to fix or how to work with. I was kind of left to the publishers who really were just interested in marketing a book on Palestine. And that book was on Palestinian citizens of Israel, and that was their only focus. And so I had a really hard time with them not understanding the politics of this work and what I wanted to accomplish with this work, because they kept coming back to me and saying, okay, this is great, but you know, can you take out some of the politics because we're not able to market you properly to a mainstream audience? And I had really big arguments about things like, what's the title? And I still never got the title I wanted. The title of the book is Palestinian Citizens of Israel, Power, Resistance, and the Struggle for Space, and I still hate it. So all of that is part of like not getting to design your path and all, you know, but at the same time, I was quite lucky that I had someone to really take me through, because the other learning experience I had from this book is that I took it too seriously in a way, which obviously makes sense. You are all going to take your writing seriously. But, you know, I rewrote this book 4 or 5 times without anybody telling me to. No one, like I said, no one was reading it. I was evolving my learning and my thinking, and I kept going, and the book had to come with me. And literally I would finish it, send it in, they would send back proofs, and then I would send them back a new draft, and they were ready to literally kill me by the end of this process. And I think I'm happy. I haven't looked back at this book in a while, but I'm happy with where the book ended up, I think. But it also taught me, but it also, I think in hindsight, really teaches us that you need to know when to stop, and you really need to know when to close a project, because this is meant as a journey. And literally that book is the first step or first stage on a very long, hopeful journey towards becoming the academic that you want to become. This is an evolving thing, and this is not the final thing. And so you close that project so that you can start somewhere else. So that was, I think, the book. The second thing I wanted to tell you about was my first academic article, which is the only article I have written that was built on my PhD project. And I know a lot of people will tell you, you can, you know, I have a good friend, she was amazing at like taking every chapter and turning them into articles. And she, as a result, has many more articles than I do. But I took one chapter and turned it into an article. And it was a really painful solo journey. And that's kind of the first thing, is that an article is not supposed to be a solo journey. I don't think actually any of this can or should be a solo journey. Your best work is going to come from collaboration. It's going to come from people giving you feedback. It's going to come from people reading your work and engaging with you. So this terribly painful, the one good thing I discovered, again, without knowing in advance, so the fact that you all are here, it means you're already better forward thinkers than I was, because I didn't know anything about the publication arena. But what I did is I actually picked a journal that I loved. I picked my favorite journal and said, this is the journal I would ultimately want any of my work to be in. It's called Antibode, and I still love it and still respect everything that comes out of it. And I went for them, and it really worked, in part because they knew what I wanted to say and they were interested in my work. And from the beginning, they could carry me through, and I've had really great experiences with the editors of that journal since then. Another lesson, it's worth getting to know editors, but that's another part. I'll let somebody else speak more to that, because I do want to get to something else. So that the problem I have with that article, why it was so painful, is that after a really easy initial R&R, I never went back to it. It took me 2 years to finally feel like I knew how to fix or edit this article. And by edit, I mean that, like the book, I rewrote it multiple times to the point where by the time I submitted it, there's absolutely nothing from the original submission that is still in the current submission. Like the final version of it, again, I'm really happy with it. I'm happy with what it was, but like I really didn't understand that it's okay that it's not perfect. It's okay that you have, again, more journeys to take. And so I think if I had had more people engage with it and talk me through that process, and also read the article, because again, no one read it except for me, and a very, very, very early version, a friend of mine read it and gave me some thoughts about including theory in the article. And that was it. The rest of it was such a solo painful journey that, like, again, I think a key part of doing this, and doing this in a way that's, I don't know, that is like kind of a less painful experience, is to get others to engage with your work and support you. Which kind of brings me to the final publication experience, which is the second publication I did. So this was a very different experience, because one thing that happened to me throughout my PhD is that I had a baby before I got to my PhD. I'm older than most people who do their PhD in this country, but I got there with a small child. And so the 4 years that I spent writing a PhD was only writing a PhD. I don't think I talked to people except in class. Like I just head down for most of that journey. And so it meant that I never got to talk to anyone about the things I was thinking about. I never really got to share platforms with people. I never really got to like kind of go through that experience, engaging with others and learning. And then right after the PhD, I became very good friends with someone who wrote really like kind of kind of in a symbiotic way to the work I was doing. We were both particularly interested in Palestine, but also very interested in engaging with Israel as a settler colonial context, but also understanding Israel as a society itself. And so we started building a network together that turned into things like a special issue, going to conferences and doing panels together, but also building a network with other people that turned into a much wider network of researchers across a plethora of cases around the world that are dealing with the question of coloniality, of settler colonialism, of Indigenous struggles, and so on. And the lesson I have from that, in addition to getting to co-author a piece that I'm really still proud of with her and another friend, as well as cultivating a special issue and also other special issues since then, is that I think it's always important to think of both your own publications and others as not something that you accumulate or hoard, but something that you build in collaboration. Because that doesn't just change like how you learn or what you learn or how good your publication is, which is also something that comes out of working with others, but also it changes academia for you, or it did for me, right? Like it really changed it into a place that you work together and think together and expand and intervene in a very different way to this very alienating space that is academic publication, academic success, or academic roles or whatever. And I'm on the dot at 10 minutes. Okay, done.
Thank you very much, Sharri. And yeah, thank you for keeping so perfectly to time, as well as for all of those excellent reflections and thoughts. Thank you. Our second panelist today is Nadje Al-Ali from Brown University, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown, where she is also Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies. Her main research interests revolve around feminist activism and gendered mobilization, mainly with reference to Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, and the Kurdish political movement. She is the author of a wide range of books and articles, including What Kind of Liberation? Women and the Occupation of Iraq, co-authored with BRISMES Vice President Nicola Pratt, Iraqi Women, Untold Stories from 1948 to the Present, Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East was an earlier book. Her co-edited book with Deborah Al-Najjar, entitled We Are Iraqis, Aesthetics and Politics in a Time of War, won the 2014 Arab American Book Prize for Nonfiction. Her most recent book is a co-edited volume, jointly edited with Denise Candioti and Catherine Spellman-Poots, entitled Gender, Governance and Islam. Professor Al-Ali is on the advisory board of KOHL, a journal of body and gender research, and she has been involved in several feminist organizations and campaigns transnationally. So handing over to you, Nadje. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Louis. It's great to be here. Can you hear me all right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, perfect. So, I mean, for those of you who might not be aware, so I only recently moved from SOAS to Brown, and I, previous to SOAS, I was teaching at the University of Exeter. So I'm very much kind of still linked to British Middle East Studies. And of course, Nicola is a good friend of mine and co-author. So I very much agree with much of what Sharri said, especially in terms of framing it, that there's not one recipe that fits all. I think that's really, really important, and I agree. And the other thing I would say, reflecting back on my own experiences, that when I think about the kind of context that Sharri found herself in, it was quite radically different from the context that I found myself in when I started publishing. So, you know, this is, so I did my PhD at SOAS between 94 and 98. And I have to say, you know, the first 10 years or so of my academic career, so to speak, I didn't think about publication strategies. I mean, I was very lucky that I had a supervisor, Professor Denise Candioti, who, while I was writing my PhD, told me, Nadje, don't write a PhD, write a book. So very early on, she actually encouraged me to think of my PhD in terms of the way I would like a book to look like, and not the PhD thesis that I saw in the library and that, you know, had sort of a theoretical framework, methodological chapter. I mean, no book looks like that. And I have to say that was incredibly helpful advice. And that's the kind of advice I've been given now my PhD students over the last 20 years, because it meant that there wasn't actually, of course, I had to do some revisions, but I didn't have to rewrite the book. I mean, I had a book that obviously I got a very constructive feedback. I was lucky because a good viva is a viva where you actually get constructive feedback that helps you towards a publication. And so I had Sami Zubaydah and Dawn Chatty as my examiners, and they provided me with really good feedback that I used to slightly revise the manuscript before sending it in. And so I had it published with Cambridge, and it was within a year it was published, and I really, really credit my supervisor's advice for that. But other than that, I mean, as Sharri was saying, I mean, for me, very much my publication very much emerged actually out of my networks and friendships. So, I would be invited to a workshop or conference, and then, someone would say, okay, let's have an edited book and you want to contribute with your chapter. And I never thought, oh, should I contribute with a chapter? A chapter doesn't count as much in the ref. I mean, I wasn't thinking in those terms at all. And it's only sort of, I guess, 10 years down the line when, the pressure started to really increase at university, where we were told, no, ref, that, I started to think twice, and I actually started to be strategic about it. So, okay, if I had a conference paper, instead of submitting it to an edited, as a chapter, an edited volume, I would try to submit it to a peer-reviewed journal. I have to say, as I was doing that, I felt quite sad and resentful. And I think I was lucky because by that time I already, had a position, and, I didn't have to worry so much about it. The other thing that I have been trying to juggle is the academic publishing with non-academic publishing. So I think of myself, I think similar to Sharri, as a kind of scholar activist. And, it would have been absurd for me when I was researching and working on the impact of the occupation and invasion on women and gender in Iraq to just write for peer-reviewed journal articles that are read by, very limited number of people. I mean, obviously, I wanted to reach a much wider audience and readership. And so I felt that, a lot of my sort of decisions were around, ticking the box, okay, I'll do this, which then frees me up to do A, B, and C. And that, I think, is something that, many of us who are trying to, who are kind of invested in some form of activism are juggling with. Before I'm going to go to more specifics in terms of article publishing, I also want to say something more general in terms of time management, because I think that is one of the main challenges we are facing in terms of publication. I mean, Sharri was mentioning, struggling with childcare. I mean, I also, well, now my daughter is 18, but, throughout much of my past years, I was, looking after a child as well. And then, of course, if you have an academic job, there's a teaching, there's admin. And I think that one of the most important things, and even that I think those of you are in the process of doing a PhD, I think that's already valid then. I would say, and maybe that's a bit controversial, but I would say that time management, good time management, counts for 50% of your academic career. It is so important. I mean, I have friends, I think, who are much, much smarter than I am, much more brilliant, but they just can't manage their time. And it doesn't mean that there's one way to manage time, because we're all different, as Sharri was saying, and, we might need different strategies. But I guess for me, what I learned early on is that you need to, at different times, you need to prioritize. And, if you're teaching and doing admin, of course, teaching could take up all your time. I just like revising a book over and over again. You could just prepare over and over again. So I think it's just really important that you block some time for your writing, for your research. I mean, that has sort of worked for me. And then, you know, there are certain times when that has to take priority. But again, I mean, I don't think there is, you know, one recipe, but I would just tell you, in my experience and having seen students and colleagues who are really struggling, it's something that it's worth investing in, good time management. So I was, prior to joining a Journal of Body and Gender Research, which is a online based journal. It's a sort of queer feminist journal in English and Arabic. And part of the whole rationale of QMUL is that the process of peer reviewing is much more mentoring, and you know, it's not, how should I say, you know, as competitive. And you know, sometimes the problem with peer reviewing is that it feels more like point scoring. And so I think that's one of the problems with academic publishing and peer reviewing, that often peer reviewers think of them each other as rivals or competitors, and you know, think that it's, to be a good academic is to put someone else down. I mean, that's unfortunately part of our academic culture. And so in both QMUL and the journal that I was involved with previously, Feminist Review, we were trying to sort of challenge that academic culture. So I also would say that in terms of peer-reviewed articles, it's really important to do your homework and choose your journal well, just as Sharri said. And then, you know, once you know which journal you want to publish in, then, you know, take your time and actually look at their style guidelines, and also look at what other articles look like. I don't believe that there is one way to publish an article, but clearly, you know, sort of thinking through having peer-reviewed many articles, often what happens is that an article is not clearly structured. I mean, you know, it should have an introduction, conclusion, and some bit in the middle. For the kind of work that I do, which is kind of more anthropological work, you know, I want to see some kind of conceptual framework. I want to see some reflections on methodology and method, you know, some evidence of original empirical material, and that kind of woven together into an argument. I want to know, what is the argument? When you send in your article and you get the reviewer's comments back, it could be tons and tons of comments. And I think one important skill to develop is to actually learn what to address and what to discard, because we all know that if someone reads it, if you read something, you read it from your perspective, and you might want to mold something into your image. I think that's another big problem with the peer-reviewed process. So I would say that the rebuttal, so the reply to the reviewer's comments, is almost as important as the revision itself. So where you actually go through each point and you describe exactly what you did to address the point, what kind of revision you did, or you provide the rationale why you not ignore that. You never say ignore. And you know, you have to be so polite and, you know, thank the reviewers. So that's very, very important. You know, don't sound upset. No, why you might think that that comment is out of the you know, bounds of this article, or beyond your, you know, find some language why you can't address it.
Sorry, Nadje, I don't want to cut you off. You just say you're at 10.5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm finishing here. Stop.
Oh, okay, sure. Sorry.
No, I think we can. Yeah, I if anything else comes up. Oh yes, just last point, co-authoring. So I've done both individual authored myself, and I mean, increasingly I like to co-author because I think it's more interesting. But I mean, it can be one of the most amazing experiences to co-author, and it can be the most frustrating experience. So, you know, choose your co-author well would be another advice. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Nadje. Yes, this is all excellent advice, really helpful. Thank you. And now our third third speaker today is Maria Marsh from Cambridge University Press, who since 2015 has looked after Cambridge University Press's African and Middle Eastern Studies lists, commissioning a broad range of books, including scholarly monographs, academic trade, textbooks, course books, and reference books. Examining a wide range of issues from Sierra Leone to Iran and from Egypt to South Africa, the list is also an interdisciplinary one, with particular areas of interest in the history and politics of these two regions. Maria was previously the Middle East Studies Commissioning Editor at IB Tauras Publishers. Over to you, Maria.
Hello, thank you. And thank you also for organising this, this event as well. So I think what's been quite interesting to hear from the two previous speakers is sort of stressing that publishing your, I'm going to talk about books actually before I start. Books, I don't look after journals. Other colleagues of mine do look after journals, so I'll only be talking to the books process. So what has been said about publishing your sort of first, second, third books is that there's no one experience to be had in this. Everyone's will be different, and some will go very smoothly and some will have a few more obstacles along the way to the finished product. So bearing that in mind, what's quite useful, I think, is for when you're coming to start thinking about putting together a proposal for your first book, is really looking at what the publishing landscape looks like. You know the sorts of books that are being published by the sorts of publishers from having done your research, but you also want to think about how your book would fit in to those different publishing houses. So whether that's a big university press in the UK, a smaller university press in the States, a trade publishing house, possibly, you're looking to see what sorts of lists these publishers have and what sort of other books these publishers have published in the past. Something that we can be quite wary of as editors is if someone approaches us with a project and says, this is the first time this has ever been done, ever. And that to us signals a word of caution, because it means we question whether there's a market for that sort of book and the sorts of markets that we can reach. So I think looking really carefully at the sorts of publishers, because Cambridge is not going to be right for everyone. Somewhere else is not going to be right for everyone. So really looking at what else the publisher has put out, I think is really useful for you deciding where you want to take your book. Because it will be a long process. Your book will be with that publishing house. You will look at it on your shelf and you want to feel like you've given it the best possible opportunity for your work. So once you've sort of had a little look at what publishing houses are out there, what their lists look like, I'd recommend dropping a line to the editor that's in charge of them. All of our emails are usually on the publishing house's websites, and striking up a conversation with the editor. I mean, especially right now when we can't meet at conferences or anything like that, sort of dropping an email is a really useful way to start up a conversation about whether your research and your project will fit that particular list. And so, yeah, as editors, you know, we are more than happy to start off these sorts of conversations. And that's, you know, part of our job is to really talk people through the first book process, especially. So I'd say not to worry about cold approaches, or just drop an email. The worst that can happen is that someone doesn't respond to you. So I think, you know, having a go is sort of the best advice that I can give at that stage. And yeah, after having sort of had a little conversation with an editor, if they ask you to submit a proposal, what I say when I've been talking to people, and the sort of proposal that we look for is really sort of looking at a table of contents and an annotated table of contents in the first instance. And so to really see how the narrative of your of the book project, how that flows and how each chapter corresponds with the sorts of ideas and arguments that you're making in the book. What I would really encourage you to think about as well is to think about this first book project as being very different to that of your PhD manuscript. So with the PhD, it's got a limited audience. It's the Viva committee that you're talking to, or possibly a couple of friends that you've managed to bribe into reading the PhD script for you. Once you're coming to the book, it's got a very different audience. You're talking to either your peers, if it's sort of quite a high level research monograph, or it's something beyond that, if you're looking to do something that's a little bit sort of has a wider reach. And so really thinking about this audience and readership for your manuscript, your book manuscript, when you're putting together your proposal is really useful, both for you in putting together the proposal and thinking about how it's a different animal to that of your PhD manuscript, but also for the publishers and for me, when I'm reading a proposal, to see that you've really thought about the readership and the audience, who's going to be looking at this book, how are they going to be using this book, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's a think tank readership, whether that's sort of a more general audience. It's always really useful for us to see that you've really been thinking about that element of who's going to be reading this and how people are going to be taking your research and thinking about your research. To talk quickly to the issue of series as well, it's always really useful for you to think about the potential for your book to be in a series when you're talking to editors as well. If you have looked at the sorts of series that that publisher has on their website and you're like, you know, it just doesn't really fit any of these, that's fine as well. And that's okay to say. But it's also really useful to know whether you see that fitting into a series and how it would fit into the series. So yeah, so once I would get a proposal, I would look over it, possibly offer any feedback if I was going to send it to a series editor to take a look over. And that's when we would get series editor feedback on a proposal as well. And, you know, all being well with the sorts of proposal, usually at Cambridge, we do ask to send material out for review alongside the proposal, especially with a first-time author. We like to have at least a few sample chapters so that we can not only get a sense of the research reviewed, but also the writing style reviewed as well. And you know, how you're reaching that target audience that you've said you want to reach in the proposal. We at Cambridge send everything out to two or usually two peer reviewers. So, I mean, that process, especially at the moment, can take anything from, you know, a couple of weeks through to a few months. You all know at the moment, our deadlines are having to be sort of flexible, dependent on what's happening around us. So yeah, at the moment, I'm sort of saying, you know, peer review is happening anywhere from extremely quickly to a few months it might possibly take for you to get responses on that process. And then, all being well, I would, or your editor would send you the reviews and get your response to the reviews before we would take it on. And I think Nadje, you were talking to the importance of the response. And for us as editors and our press editorial board, which we call the syndicate, because it's Cambridge and we have to call it things like that, they like to see authors really engaging with the reviewers and with the points that the reviews have. And it flags a word of caution to us if an author has really stood very stubbornly against the reviews and sort of rejects what the reviewer says. I mean, to us it says, you know, this might possibly come up at post-publication review. You know, there might be issues with it there. And there might also, it's going to be probably hard to work with this author throughout the process if they're sort of quite stubborn about responding to the review. So, you know, as a working process, but also as something for the final outcome for you, it is really good to engage with the reviewers seriously. That's not saying that you have to take on board everything that a review says. Of course you don't. And given that there's more than one review, there's a likelihood that the reviewers might possibly contradict each other. So you have to find a way to talk around how you're going to be finding a track through the sort of the reviews and what their responses are. So yeah, I think I might wrap things up there, because what I usually find is it's more useful to talk to people's individual experiences and see the sorts of questions that people might have, rather than me go on at length, because you know, we tend to take each book as an individual project as well. And this is reflected in the sort of strategies that we decide for the book as well. Because I think something that's worth saying is that it's not necessarily destined, if your book is being converted from a dissertation into a book, that we would do it as a high-priced library book immediately. That is a conversation that we have with our sales and marketing teams. And it's based very much on what your proposal looks like, what the reviews look like, and also the sorts of sales that books in similar subject areas have done in the past. So it's really taking each book on a case-by-case basis. So we'd really encourage you know, any questions about individual cases.
Great, thanks so much, Maria. That was really helpful. And thank you to everyone who is putting your questions into the chat. I'm making a note of them all. Do keep them coming as we listen to our final speaker, and then we'll come back to everyone's questions for the Q&A. Our fourth speaker is Stephanie Cronin from the University of Oxford, who is the Elahi Omidyar Mir Jalali Research Fellow at St Antony's College and a member of the Faculty of Oriental Studies, where she teaches graduates in modern Middle Eastern studies, specifically Iranian history and history from below in the Middle East and North Africa. She has also held an Iran Heritage Foundation Fellowship for many years and is the series general editor of the Edinburgh Historical Studies of Iran and the Persian World. She is the author and editor of a great many books, which would be indeed far too many for me to be able to name right now, but I'll name a few of the recent ones. She's the author of Histories of Iran, Modernism and Marginality in the Middle East, which is coming out this year, in fact, with Cambridge University Press. Armies and State Building in the Modern Middle East, Politics, Nationalism and Military Reform, as well as the author of Soldiers, Shahs and Subalterns in Iran, Opposition, Protest and Revolt, 1921 to 1941. She's also the editor of a great many volumes, including Crime, Poverty and Survival in the Middle East and North Africa, The Dangerous Classes, quote unquote, since 1800, and Anti-Veiling Campaigns in the Muslim World, Gender, Modernism and the Politics of Dress. So thanks very much for being here with us, Stephanie, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to give this little talk. It's a great pleasure, and I think very useful, because as Nadje said, one of the things that's changed a lot over the past few years is the importance of a publication strategy. And I also, when I was a PhD student, and even after that, very little was ever said to me about how I should publish, why I should publish, and all the rest of it. So clearly, in the environment in which we now find ourselves, jobs are very scarce. And when a graduate student makes an application for a job, one of the things that the selection committee will be looking for is a record of publication. So it's become much more important than it was, I think, for my generation. Also, when you finally get an appointment, the rest, which is a heavily bureaucratized kind of process, demands that you have such a strategy. So it is something that's worth thinking about very carefully. But all I'm going to do really is make some general remarks, some of which have already been made, but I'll just put my own spin on them, about both books and articles, because Yes, they're different, but most graduate students are faced with the necessity of doing both. So it's worth also to consider what we can learn about how you approach both these things, and maybe avoid making too many of the kind of blunders that are only too common and which I look back on in my own career with some embarrassment. Now, as it has been said already, a PhD thesis is very different to a book. When you write a PhD thesis, you know it's going to be read by your examiners and maybe one or two people in the academic community who are working on very similar topics, but you don't expect it to have a wide readership. Consequently, you don't really need to pay attention, for example, to style. And one of the things I would say is that when you come to think about how you're going to rewrite your own thesis, you think about what you yourself have found particularly useful and interesting and gripping in terms of what you've read. So if you read a book or you come across an academic article which really sticks in your mind, which you really benefited from, think about how they did it. What kind of approach did they adopt? How deconstruct that particular article or look in detail at that particular book and see why you found it particularly useful, and arm yourself with some notion of how you might take advantage of that approach in your own work. If you're rewriting a PhD thesis, also think about your writing style, because you do want people to read it. That's the difference. You actually are writing for a readership, and you want people to think that this is well written, because if it's well written, then it will also have academic credibility. So don't neglect things like writing style altogether. And certainly, speaking as a historian, one of the things that I always tell my graduate students is to read as much history as you can, written by the leading figures in the field. Because by reading, you can hone your own writing skills. And when you make the transition from graduate student to published academic, that's going to be an important thing. Yes, it's true that you have to look at the list of publishers to try to find one that you think fits academically and intellectually. But I'm sorry also to introduce a kind of note of hard reality, but some publishers are more prestigious than others. And when you come to apply for jobs, you want to have the most prestigious CV that you can. So again, this is something that a little bit to detract from the kind of ivory tower nature of academic life, but there are some hard realities. And if you have a book coming out with a very prestigious publisher, particularly the university presses, it will make a better impression, in my opinion, than if it comes out with a commercial publisher. So I think in terms of marketing yourself, unfortunately, you have to do this. You're going to try to sell yourself to appointments boards. You want the most prestigious publisher you can find. The other reason I think for preferring a university press is that, in my experience, again, they're much more careful in terms of the process. They'll take the peer reviewing process much more seriously. They'll give you much more useful feedback. And they'll be more flexible about things which are very dear to your heart, but which are normally handed over to marketing. For example, Sharri mentioned the question of titles. There's always a clash between the author and marketing about the title. And I think I've had this with all the books that I've published. I've never got exactly the title that I wanted. But I think in general, a university press is going to be a little bit more flexible about these issues than a commercial publisher, precisely because a commercial publisher is motivated really entirely by the bottom line. They want to make money. Whereas a university press, although it's also a commercial operation, but it's a little bit softer on some of these issues, in my experience anyway. Again, you do need to think about this. So some of the, you might say, more technical issues. For example, do you want to hold out for a paperback simultaneously published with the hardback? Are you happy to have a paperback published 18 months down the line? You need to think about this a little bit. Obviously, again, if you want to sell copies of the book, it has to be out in paperback. If you're content for books to be sold more or less exclusively to libraries, then you'll be happy just to go for the hardback. But publishers, again, resist a little bit the idea of a paperback, especially simultaneous with the hardback. But some of them do publish like that, and you will sell more. So again, you have to think about how important that is to you. It, again, intersects with other issues. For example, if you were to go to a publisher like Brill, which is extremely influential in academic and intellectual terms, but the books are priced beyond the range of anyone outside of the oligarchy, as far as I can tell. I mean, now very, very expensive. And even libraries balk at them a little bit sometimes. So, you know, you have to measure, again, prestige versus readership, sales, versus accessibility, and so on. So there are those kinds of things to think about. Another factor, of course, is speed. How quickly do you need it out? Are you applying for jobs at the moment? Does it need to go on your CV? Again, different publishers, some are very much slower than others. So again, you think, are you going to go for prestige, possibly taking longer? Do you need it out within 6 months so you can apply for jobs with it in your hand? These are also issues that you need to think about. Regarding articles more specifically, again, some journals are simply more prestigious than others. And I think it's a good idea, especially when you're at the graduate student phase and you're thinking about jobs, or maybe you're in your first job and you need to think about promotions and so on. You do need to think also about the prestige of the journal, and also about whether you want to go for a specialized journal or a more mainstream journal. So, for example, in terms of the specialist journal, obviously in my own area, we have Iranian Studies, which is a highly regarded journal, very rigorous peer-reviewed articles and so on, but it's only ever going to be seen by the field of Iranian Studies. Again, you could go for the International Journal of Middle East Studies in America, or Middle Eastern Studies, or the BRISMES Journal here. If you want to make a reputation for yourself within the field of Middle Eastern or Iranian Studies, depends on the journal. But you might want to consider a more mainstream journal, which will again give your work an entry into much wider areas of academic life. And again, to some extent, this depends on your strategy for future employment. So, for example, in my own field, social history, there are several very, very well-respected journals which don't look at the Middle East to any degree, but which concentrate much more on things like European social history or global history, for example. And you might find it useful, especially in the climate in which we live at the moment, where there are very few jobs in Middle Eastern studies, to think about marketing yourself in a rather wider sense. So if you get articles in the Journal of Global History, for example, or in Comparative Studies in Society and History, or the Journal of Peasant Studies, or these sorts of journals, then an appointments committee will look at you as a much more useful person than if you're solely concentrated, for example, in Iranian studies. Well, unless the job is in Iranian studies, which is very, very unlikely these days, you're going to be seen as a bit niche. So you need to think about that. What are you? Are you going to be someone exclusively working on the Middle East, or are you going to try to be able to present yourself as someone who has much wider interests and therefore fits more neatly into a kind of mainstream department? There are very few departments these days in British universities that feel they can specialize to the extent, for example, where they'd employ someone with my kind of publication record. I think that does introduce difficulties. So you need to think about things like that.
I don't want to, sorry to interrupt you, Stephanie. You're also at 10.5 minutes. So
I haven't got much more to say. Just please do make whether it's a book, manuscript, or an article, please do make it as good as you can. Don't just take a chapter from your PhD thesis and submit it as an article. It won't work. you need not to rewrite everything quite to the extent that Sharri described herself as doing, but you do need to make a journal article standalone, and that requires thinking about what are they really about, and not being a bit kind of too trying to do things too quickly, cutting corners and missing the point. Finally, one last word. I suppose my main piece of advice today is do develop a thick skin, because academic life is not necessarily a very friendly place. You will get some savage rejections, and you have to learn some resilience, and you have to learn how to benefit from the savage rejections, because sometimes the savage rejections are more helpful than the nice things. So just grit your teeth and don't give up. Okay, that's it.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. All really helpful and thought-provoking advice. Thank you